Greetings, I'm Christopher Hildt, and on this episode of Tales from the Hildt, we're going to be reading some out of Grey Fury. Now, Grey Fury Sunset Blue. I was just going to do the first chapter, but I decided to go ahead and read the prologue. So if you want to skip to just chapter 1, you can do that. The prologue has a lot of necessary information for the backstory on the world that Grey Fury and his men inhabit. And I wanted to save a lot of what we're doing today for this video, so I didn't really do a long review for it in the Grey Fury video. But today we're going to read the Grey Truth, but we're going to read the prologue first because I just decided that a little extra content couldn't hurt, and it basically will tell you what's going on in the whole world. Like I said, Joe fans, you'll probably like this. It's definitely not fantasy. It's a post-apocalyptic world, and well, it took me a while to really finish this book. I started it, as I said in the Grey Fury video, way back in the 80s, and really perfected it in the early 2000s, and got really into writing it and finished it up probably around 2002, I would say, but I didn't ever get it published until 2010. Alright, so with that all being said, let's just jump right into it. Alright, we're going to get my glasses on so I can see what I'm doing. Now, it's been a while since I've read this too, so it's ought to be kind of fun. I've been eager to actually get into this since I got the hardcover done. Such a nice cover, I think. But that's just me, unbiased. Okay. Grey Fury Prologue. The 21st century. Thought by some to be the greatest era of mankind. Technology rose to great heights, and mankind smiled on its achievements. Even early on, however, the threat of war and an all-consuming end hung heavy in the air. The larger countries of the world became no more than mass business conglomerates, intent on only advancing their holdings and increasing their net worth. Sad to say, but the forerunner of these business conglomerates, disguised as governments, was the United States of America. Capitalism at its best and worst. After convincing themselves and some of the rest of the world that they wanted only peace, the mighty nations seized control of most of the globe. What remained of the nations that were still unconstrained by the yoke of freedom banded together and waged war on the last great superpower. World War III was short compared to most other wars, and was over inside of a year. The United States claimed the victory, but at a terrible cost. In the end, a nuclear solution was tried, but it became rapidly apparent that the U.S. was only interested in advancing their holdings still further. Using the power of their nuclear devices to great effect in the upper atmosphere caused most of their enemies' devices to simply fail to function by destroying their power. Electromagnetic pulses, or simply EMP, sapped most of the power on Earth for a time. Unfortunately, however, as often happens, not all of the devices were stopped. The damage done to our poor Earth was horrific, to say the least. When the terror was at last over, there was little fight left in anyone, and the arduous task of repairing the wounds and hurts caused by the most powerful war machine in history began. Over the years that followed, the U.S. took sole control of the Earth, but their holdings were weak at best. Financially, they were ruined, and only through the intervention of private and religious institutions was the nation able to survive. Once again, capitalism reared its ugly head, and soon individuals gained control of a vast majority of what became the new nations of the earth. However short-lived, the U.S. government fell under the control of what became the ruling Congress. This Congress was filled with governors of the mightiest nations on earth. Territories were divided into regions, and when all was said and done, the United States of America simply became the United States, with 247 states around the globe. A new capital was erected, and what was Denver, Colorado, became Denver, the capital city of the world. Time wore on, and the world seemingly went on. People went back to living virtually as they always had done. But technology seemed to come to a standstill. Picking up the pieces became very costly, and at length many of the new states decided that they shouldn't have to pay for the damage that was done to other states. It was not hard to predict what was about to ensue. Alliances were quickly formed and war seized control once more, only this time the resources of the world had been almost spent in its restoration, and wisely most of the nuclear weapons had been done away with. Even more important, the great resource the world had was also in short supply. Not oil, not energy, but manpower. As World War IV grew to fruition, it became apparent that the only weapons that were going to win this war were the hands that wielded them. So it rapidly became a race to protect the soldiers fighting the battle. As in days of old, men began casting themselves in armor. This, however, is the 21st century, so with what science was available, all sides, as they were confusedly enough to both a multitude of factions, sought not bulky restrictive metals or heavy and cumbersome suits of mail, as did their forefathers, but as you would expect, many protections were employed. Each government raced to design their suits of armor made of flexible steel alloy plates that cover the bodies of every soldier. It became a race to make the strongest armor and the best armor-piercing rounds. In the states still found in the Americas, centered around the capital of Denver, a brilliant scientist called an armor tech by the name of Brandon Pinchot developed an alloy that he believed was flexible yet indestructible. In desperation, the government still called the U.S. gave his radical ideas the go-ahead and 4 budding test subjects to work with. It not only gave the U.S. the opportunity for winning the war, but also created for them a fortuitous chance of possibly ridding themselves of a potential threat to their authority. This threat came in the form of a military man with a glorious yet questionable career. Test subject number 1, Colonel Warren P. Wellington, commander of the 14th Armored Division. This individual was responsible for several key victories that had led to the stability of most U.S. territories and borders. His unit, handpicked and trained by the colonel himself, had become the most respected fighting force on Earth. However, his views and ideals were constantly under scrutiny by his superiors. Yet this persistent officer always managed to win the day, who, never having retreated from the field in defeat, and always managing to bring about the best possible outcome for every engagement or assignment under his command. Recommended for brigadier general 3 times, but held back for serious incidents of borderline insubordinations, especially where it concerned his second in command. Test subject number 2. Captain Eugene Gray Manning, field leader of the 14th Armored Division. This individual has been responsible for many of the incidents which brought scrutiny to his commanding officer. Although Manning was once one of the most competent as well as determined officers in the U.S. Army, his temperament and almost reckless disregard for the lives of the men under his command have caused him and Colonel Wellington a wide array of inquests from their superiors. All that had saved his career has been the fact that although his motives have been questionable, his results were not. Test subject number 3, First Lieutenant Mark Nicholas H. Falanto, third in command of the 14th Armored Division. Like his immediate superior, Captain Manning, Lieutenant Falanto seemed to be a reckless and carefree officer. His only motive appeared to be an insatiable desire to put himself, as well as the men under his command, at an unnecessary risk. The lieutenant has been passed over for promotion several times due to his thrill-seeking attitude, and only his amazing strategic abilities in the field saved him from court-martial on more than one occasion. Because of the man's mental fortitude, his other failings were mainly overlooked. Test subject number 4, Second Lieutenant William R. Marcus, fourth in command of the 14th Armored Division. The lieutenant is an orphan that had exceptional test scores and was drafted into the armed forces. His wit during training elevated his status in the eyes of his instructors, so he was sent to officer candidate school where he excelled with great proficiency. His only flaw seems to be in his ability to detach his personal feelings towards his subordinates. In spite of his rank, he constantly made decisions that favored their lives, thus making him the link of the chain of command, while at the same time held him back for advancement, even though his prowess as a strategist was on par with his superiors. 4 men desperately needed, while at the same time were a growing threat and concern for individuals throughout the U.S. government. They were noteworthy heroes among the military, who were at the same time a convenient means to an end. After all, why not give the best new armor to the best and the brightest? Dr. Pinchot's armor may have been experimental, but the risk seemed well worth it, if the armor protected a soldier the way he claimed it would. The initial testing phase had an amazing success, and Dr. Pinchot's armored hounds were already in use in the field. Captain Manning had volunteered to be the first test subject, but Colonel Wellington wouldn't hear of it. The initial risk was to be his and his alone. He went through the 3 days of the agonizing molding process, which Dr. Pinchot believed would be more effective than an instant molding process. This armor was far different from any others that had come before it. Most conventional armors of the day are sectional and adjustable, but Dr. Pinchot's was like a second skin that could never be removed. This metallic skin covered the legs, midsection, and the arms of the subject completely. Only a small portion about the crotch, for obvious reasons, and the head were left unmolded. For the head, helmets of the same material had been fitted for the 4 subjects. As for the lower region, a similar covering was constructed and form-fitted for each subject. Once the process was completed on the Colonel, the test phases began. No form of ordnance yet constructed could penetrate the armor, and fire did nothing to the Colonel. Instruments that caused cold or freezing effects also left the Colonel unharmed. Next, they tested sound waves and microwaves. All such attacks bounced off harmlessly, as well as invisibly. They bounced off the armor, leaving the subject in perfect health. In short, the doctor had achieved a resounding success. Unfortunately, Colonel Wellington's body gave out before the testing could be completed. He was not physically injured, but the strain was simply more than he could bear. The Colonel fell into a deep catatonic state and became communicative, if I can say it correctly. The full results of the testing had been withheld from the 3 remaining subjects, but when the government review committee viewed the testing results and had the Colonel examined thoroughly, Dr. Pinchot's experiments were in jeopardy. The head of the review committee was Supreme Court Justice Eugene R. Manning, who, although had a rocky relationship with his son, Captain Manning, was not about to stand by and let this condition be forced upon his son. So he cut the funding for the project and ordered it to be canceled. Unfortunately, Dr. Brandon Pinchot was not so easily dismissed, and had anticipated their reaction. He had his personal bodyguards kill the entire committee disguised as soldiers from the 14th Armored Division and returned to his lab. As a result of the council's assassination, the civil authorities were outraged. Naturally, an investigation was conducted, but the perpetrators of the crime had yet to be found. For although members of the 14th Armored Division had been detained and questioned, it became clear that they had nothing to do with the crime. These findings were unacceptable to the civil authorities, and a coup quickly ensued. Consequently, this resulted in a massive civil uprising. The government called in the military to resolve the issue, but in the meantime, Dr. Pinchot continued his experiment and rushed the molding process of the 3 remaining subjects. The same afternoon, he had the committee assassinated. It was his hope that by using an experimental drug to render his test subjects in a death-like state would result in their enduring the molding process without mental scarring, as had happened to the Colonel. Unfortunately, Lieutenant Filanto seemed rather resistant to the anesthetic and was awake during the entire armorizing process. In their officer's absence, the 14th Armored Division fell under the command of Gunnery Sergeant Reginald F. Parker, a serious Marine with a clear sense of duty, and Staff Sergeant Alexander B. McFab, an airborne ranger with an eye for conspiracy and a sense for trouble. As the only armored force available, they quickly got the civil authorities under control, and together with the leaders of those forces, they discovered the true architect of the whole plot. With a unified front on the situation, both civil and military forces converged on the lab of Dr. Pinchot. The good doctor completed the armorizing process and fitted the attachments to his test subjects, and it was only then that he realized that one of them, specifically Lieutenant Filanto, had remained awake during the molding process. At first he seemed lethargic and was unable to respond. Apparently, the drug had only kept him from feeling most of what had been done to him, but his mind suddenly woke up to the fact of what had happened, and he became ablaze in fury. Dr. Pinchot was forced to retreat, and his lab was completely destroyed along with all of his work. Filanto's rage ended at the sight of his unit busting into the lab, and with the calming words of his staff sergeant that all was well. At first they believed that both Captain Manning and Lieutenant Marcus had been killed during the armorizing process, but after closer examination it was discovered that they were very much alive. Dr. Pinchot had escaped, and with him he had apparently taken Colonel Wellington, as there was no sign of or trace of him within the complex outside the lab. Meanwhile, there was still a war to be fought, so after they recovered from the armorizing process, Captain Manning and his lieutenants resumed their duties, and temporary command of the 14th Armored Division was given to them. The new armor, however, seemed very effective, and soon the 14th Armored Division became an unstoppable force. In less than a year, they rooted out most of the other major governments and brought them down. It was a terrible and horrible time, as wars often are, and at last the U.S. government claimed victory once more. However, the cost was too great, and they had no lasting control. Although their armored units maintained what was considered U.S. soil, the rest of the world fell into a state of anarchistic decay. The 14th Army Unit returned to Denver to a hero's welcome, but in a surprising turn of events, they set upon their own government and virtually wiped the city of Denver off the face of the planet, as they had done so successfully to the other capitals of the world. It became a driving force for Captain Bannon to destroy any form of governmental control. It became his belief that mass governments were the cause of all the world's problems. Furthermore, it became his purpose to stop war entirely by stopping governments entirely. And at first his lieutenants agreed with him, but after the U.S. government fell, they both believed that it was over, and each questioned their sanity. Their men were loyal, but even to them the war was finally over. The captain acquiesced and disbanded the unit. Marcus and their two sergeants returned home, but Volanto simply vanished. Captain Manning attempted for a while to settle down and start living life, but a new government arose, and he wouldn't stand for it. He assembled what men he could and started anew. It was not long before he succeeded in destroying the new government, and it was clear to him that he couldn't stop there. After many years of fighting, he eventually settled on the western side of North America, near where he grew up. He kept his team together, and whenever the hint of a government arose, he would attack them with astonishing fury. Thus, only small settlements and communal groups existed across the globe, and he became known as the Gray Fury. He never went by Eugene, as he felt that that was his father's name, and was always called by his middle name of Gray. His men became fanatically loyal. Whenever Captain Fury would call them, they would join up, and with him again. They would join up with him again, and his following constantly grew. But after a time, he saw his growing army turning into the thing he hated most, so he disbanded his force and only kept a small group near him. But as is often the case, the world around him came to either love or hate the man called Gray Fury. He was loved by the most that knew him, and hated by those who desired some form of control. Forces began to unite against him, and despite the urgings and advice of his men, he continued on as he always had done, attacking governments as they would arise and annihilating them. This, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your point of view, could not last forever. After all, the Gray Fury, in spite of his bulletproof skin and the legend that surrounded him, was still just a mortal man. Okay, that ends the prologue. And we're going to get into chapter 1 here in a second. I just wanted to say that writing the prologue, I actually did after chapter 1. And I knew the storyline, but I hadn't put it to paper, so I wanted to before I had the first chapter of the book, I wanted to give the reader the sense of what the world was and what the 14th Armored Division left behind. All right, before we jump into chapter 1, I wanted to give a little bit of context here. When I was writing this, I was actually finishing up my high school, and I was in a fine arts class, and I wrote this as a project for the class. That I had a really good teacher who had this really cool reading voice that I always kind of wanted to just read stories to people too. So I guess that's why I'm here doing this. Now, when I was writing this, I always imagined that it started up with the song by Whitesnake, "Here I Go Again," but that's just me. So let's get into it. I'll get my glasses back on and we'll just read. Chapter 1, The Gray Truth. It was quiet across the southern California desert. The only prevalent sound aside from the gently blowing wind was the constant footfalls of the only apparent life form still clinging to the last desperate chance for continued existence. The unending and scorching light provided by the sun was suddenly blocked slightly from view. The haggard man glanced skyward, not even bothering to cover his eyes from the brightness found there, and what he saw forced a smile to crack his chapped lips. Heavy black clouds loomed on the horizon. Lightning struck, and thunder cracked the air. Then the clouds suddenly broke, and water descended from on high, blanketing the cracked desert floor. The ragged figure of a man witnessed these events with great delight. His head tilted back slightly as the rain drenched his face, and he sighed wholeheartedly. The dusty brown cowboy hat that had been pushed way back upon his head and seemingly forgotten was suddenly lifted from his brow and fell to the ground. Uncaringly he stared at the heavens as the water ran down his burnt and blistered cheeks. It had been 4 months since the man had seen another living soul, and 4 long months since he had been marooned in the wasteland. He had been forced to eat whatever he could find, and that was quite scarce. He had done a great deal of thinking in that time, but all he could think about now was how great the rain felt as it poured down over him in buckets. It was great to be alive. He watched the rain turn his trench coat a dark brown in color as the sand and dirt was washed away. Yet even the sun pelting down at him for 4 months could not destroy this man's wit. From the pocket of his coat, he freed a small metal container, popped the cap off of the canteen, and held it outward, and let the rain fill it up. He screwed the cap back on and slid the flask back down into his coat, then bent over and snatched up his hat. He fixed it back into place upon his head. The rain stopped just as abruptly as it had begun, and the clouds immediately gave way to the scorching rays of the sun. In mere minutes, the small puddles of water around vanished into the air, and the ground seemed to cry as its surface once again became cracked and brittle. After a moment's rest, he started his impossible journey again. The names of the young men of his team kept flashing through his mind. They had envied him and followed him to their death. A new power arose in the land and had seized control of most of the western side of North America, so naturally it had to come down. At last the mountains were in the distance, to the south, but they were small comfort to him. Once again he had survived. He had lost men in battle before, but never so brutally. They were ready for him, and they knew his tactics. His mind raced, and he was suddenly distracted by movement ahead of him. Moments later he started to chew on the tarantula he had crushed, and then continued towards the mountains. The snow-covered peaks were inviting, but represented an entirely different problem to him. It was his hope that the pass was free of obstruction. His enemy hadn't managed to advance this far south when he pushed the thought from his mind as he continued onward. The sun glinted off his metallic skin as he rubbed the soreness from his shoulder, and his coat parted. It was all that had saved him, this cursed armor of his. His boots had given out after the first month, and he was glad that his feet could not be harmed by the desert floor. The jeep was hit, and Donner and Mitchell were killed instantly. There had been no sign, no warning. They just suddenly were flying through the air. Donner was behind the wheel, and that boy had been with him for almost 6 years. And Mitchell. No use torturing himself, he thought darkly, as he remembered prying his way out of the debris of the burning jeep. His sun visor was cracked and useless as he grabbed his shotgun. No, can't think of this now, he warned himself. But he could not keep the memories from flooding his mind. Porter, Miller, and Dean had been just behind them. Each one had a story and a reason for joining him. Chance and Jagger came up with the heavy assault rifles and unloaded in the direction their unseen enemy fired at them from. They had been in the truck at the rear and had jumped clear when it got hit. Ben, O'Connell, and Devine never came out of the burning wreckage. It had all been so sudden. No, mustn't torture himself now. Not when he was so near. The mountains were just a 3-hour march to the south. Jagger suddenly cried out as red heat burst through his midsection. He turned and fired at nothing in particular. Chance jumped behind some brush and rolled into a ditch. Teflon-coated shells bounced off his chest as he caught sight of some of his foes and charged forward. Suddenly they were all around him. Small arms fire ripped through the night and screamed for blood. 10 of them were dead in just a few moments, but now he was out of ammo. The gun was thrust aside as he knelt down and pulled his knife free. Chance fired at their foes from the far bank of the ditch and cut some more down. They tried to get a bead on his position, but he was gone just as fast as he had opened fire. Once more he charged at his foes, and his 12-inch blade cut 2 of them down quickly, but still more came on. "No, stop it," the man shouted out loud, and it echoed across the desert. He looked around cautiously, but there was no one around. He pressed on and reached the foot of the mountains and headed west. He could see the remains of the once great highway ahead of him. The road still ran through the pass, but beyond that, to the north, it was rent and broken in an uneven line until it disappeared altogether. Poor Chance, he thought suddenly, and just as quickly pushed the memory from his mind. He headed into the pass. He headed into the pass to the south quickly, headed into the pass to the south, and quickly caught sight of a cougar stalking his movements. The man dropped to the ground as the great cat approached. Cautiously it moved forward and sniffed at the now limp form. It waited several moments before it moved in for the kill. The animal expertly bit into the man's leg and suddenly jerked its head away, howling in pain. In a snap, the man was on his feet, and he grappled with the beast, and the two rolled off of the road and into a patch of soft earth. He couldn't get a good grip on the cat, and in his weakened state, the animal quickly pounced on top of him and batted him across the face. The man was stunned as the cat sniffed its paw and realized that the creature before him had a weak spot. The blood running down the man's face cut into his blistered cheeks and stung madly. Once more the cat was on his chest and pinning him to the ground, its jaws expertly surging forward, and only the quick thrust of the man's arm saved his life. But it was only a matter of time before the cougar could break through and bite his exposed head. He tried to roll away, but didn't have the strength. He grabbed hold of the big cat's head with one hand and reached into his coat pocket with the other. In an instant, his blade was free of the pocket, and he stabbed upward, striking the cat in the side. The beast rolled with the assault, and its own blood flowed freely now, but it wasn't about to give up its meal so easily. The man stumbled to his feet, and the cat leapt at him again. Paw struck the exposed flesh as diamond blade was jammed into the cat's side once more. The man thrust the lifeless form from him as he dropped to his knees and stared at his foe. The cougar grimaced as it tried to stand. It stumbled and fell, but then rose again. The man stared at the cat admirably as it turned to look at him. Their eyes locked for many moments, and the two accepted their fates with grim admiration. But with one last surge of its great strength, the beast leapt forward once more. The man dropped onto his back weakly and caught the cat with his feet and kicked it away. Excuse me. It landed upon the roadway with a cracking thud, and it rolled over weakly, but the man knew there was no fight left in the beast, as he rose to his feet and brought his blade down swiftly, piercing the cougar's brain. "There was more honor in you than the bastards that killed my boys," he said to the fallen cat with respect. He lied there for some time before he could move, with only real strength, and with honor he cut into the beast and started to skin it. It took him a while to get a small fire going, but it was clear they would spend the night here. After all, dinner had been provided for him. The morning peeked over the horizon to the east, glinting off the mountains and making them appear as great shadows jutting up into the sky. The meal he had on the previous night was cooked, and although cold now, made a decent breakfast. He buried what remained of the beast and nodded in respect as he once more started into the pass. Rested and fed, he climbed into the mountains, and by late afternoon he found himself descending into the valley on the south side. He was nearly home, and he hoped that he had a home to return to. He dreaded the thought of coming this far, only to be denied his bed and those that cared for him. Once again his thoughts turned to Chance. He had managed to circle around and provide cover for him as he was forced to retreat. The two had joined up and were running into the thick woodland to the east of the road. He remembered Chance's smile as he turned and looked toward his friend and mentor. They had reached the woods and had only taken cover for a few moments, and then they could return fire, retreating even further into the woods. Suddenly his throat exploded. The sniper was good, but not good enough, as the boy fell into his arms. He was only 19, the man thought bitterly, as Chance fell into his arms. He pulled the boy swiftly behind a tree. Several stray shots fell around them, as slowly and painfully Chance bled to death. In frustration, he grabbed the lad's rifle and stood out in the open. A bullet glanced off his shoulder as he zeroed in on the sniper and pulled the trigger. Sheets of metal scattered into the trees on the west side of the road and shattered them. Aiming was not required with a heavy machine gun, as he emptied the belt into the tree line and watched as the sniper exploded into several pieces. Dozens of men were in pursuit of him now, as he glanced sadly down at Chance before bolting into the forest. It would not be long before his pursuers caught up with him, he knew, so he headed for the one place they would not follow him, the southern waste. which was an expanse of land that stretched from what used to be Fresno, California, all the way down to the San Bernardino Mountains. He had wandered those deserted wastelands for 4 months now, but as he looked southward and saw the billowing clouds of smoke ascending from the buildings beyond, hope glimmered upon his bruised and sun-battered face. Weariness overwhelmed him as he stumbled into the last stretched bar. Home. The doors gave way easily, and a crowd looked at him excitedly. "Gray!" the bartender started to exclaim with joy. But when he saw the condition of the man before him, he darted towards him. "Clara!" he shouted, as the man called the Grey Fury stumbled into his arms. Presently the woman rushed from some other room behind the bar. The heavy-set gray bartender held Captain Manning's weak form in his strong arms. The young woman, of maybe 25 years of age, rushed towards him. She brushed her dark hair out of her eyes as her nimble form rushed toward the bartender and her fallen friend. She looked at his face and started suddenly at the sight. "Go and get some water and hot towels, girl," the bartender snapped at her harshly, but she just stared at the Grey Fury in disbelief. "Go on, Clara," he ordered her once more, as he lifted his charge up and started to carry him towards the stairway. The girl looked at him in surprise, but then quickly did as she was told. With great effort, he started up the stairs with a groan. "Is it going to be all right, Terry?" one of the patrons asked, the bartender with great concern. "We'll know by morning, Phil," Terry replied, as he ascended the stairs and out of their view. Those assembled in the bar exchanged worried glances, as they had been worried what had happened to their departed friends for some time. "I knew it," one of them shouted suddenly. "I've been saying it all along." "Shut up, Glenn," Phil turned on the other angrily. "Don't tell me to shut up," Glenn shouted back. "I told you all that he would get all those boys killed. I said, mark my words, he'll get them all killed. But would anybody listen? Oh, no. He's the Grey Fury, history's greatest warrior. Can't lead our boys to their deaths." "Johnson's my boy," another shouted at Glenn angrily, "and I was proud that he decided to join in the Grey Fury's cause. If anything's happened to him, then it was his choice." "His choice?" a blonde-haired woman in her late 30s shouted in anger. "You know as well as I do, Pierre, that those boys worship the ground he walks on. Jagger is my son, and if that bastard has got him killed, I'll kill him in his sleep." "Bold words, Ida," an elderly man said to her calmly, with the end of his cane. "My grandson went off with him too, but I don't think the Fury can be killed." "Well, I says he can, Thomas Miller," she snapped at him. "What are we saying?" Phil chimed in as he stroked his black beard. "Gray has sacrificed everything for us. He helped us build the whole town. We're a family. If something's happened to the Furies, and we owe Gray the chance of telling us what happened." "There you go again, Phil," Glenn shouted at him. "You're always jumping up to his defense." "Damn right," he snapped back. "I'm willing to bet none of you would be bad-mouthing him if he was on his feet and right here in this room." "The hell I wouldn't," Ida shouted angrily. Clara entered the room with towels and a pail of water as the argument began in earnest. She tried to silence them, but they ignored her, and the room would have erupted in violence as Terry, having just come down the stairs to see what the commotion was, called their attention sharply. "All of you shut up or go home. This is my bar, and I won't hear a word said against Grace so long as I'm within earshot. You wouldn't even be standing here if not for that man upstairs. You'd all be dead. I can't count how many times he's fought off the raiders. We live in prime fertile country here, and his reputation alone has kept them from ruining all we've got going on here." "Wouldn't be no raiders if not for him," Ida snapped as she headed for the door and slammed it on her way out. The bartender looked around angrily at those who remained. "Anyone else?" He paused for a moment, but no one said a word. "Good." Terry looked up at Claire calmly and motioned for her to go on up. "What about Chance and the others?" Pierre asked the bartender worriedly. Terry looked at his friend solemnly and shook his head. "I don't know. But with the shape Gray is in, I fear the worst." The room was deathly quiet for many moments. At length, Terry swallowed hard and went around to the back of the bar. "The next round's on me, boys, so you can just tell Ida she missed out." "She's just worried about her boy," Pierre stated quietly, "like me." "I know. We all are," Terry said to him solemnly as he grabbed a bottle of whiskey and started to fill their glasses. As morning came upon the small community of Collis Park Way, most of the citizens woke early and were in the last stretch bar eager for news. But Gray didn't wake up all that day, or that night, but upon the following morning he woke to the sounds of Clara bringing him breakfast. "Tell me," he began weakly, and his voice cracked dryly. Tell me it was a nightmare. The young girl glanced at him quickly and then looked down. I'm afraid I can't, Gray. Everyone's anxious for news of their kid. Even those orphaned boys, Porter and Dean, seem to be missed. Are they alive? She looked at him solemnly. Now, but he rose shortly and sat up. His silence was the only answer she needed. She started to leave, but he grabbed the sleeve of her blouse lightly and looked up at her. Tell the others, he began weakly. I'll be down soon to tell them everything. Clara nodded as she started to leave, but then she turned from the doorway and looked at him thoughtfully. There are some strangers downstairs as well, she informed him methodically. They're looking for you, too, but I think they're some of Ida Pritchard's family from over in the East Highlands. I don't think they're going to take the news well, and in your condition. Gray cut her off quickly. I'll be all right. His voice seemed calm, and he had regained some strength. She nodded doubtfully as she passed through the door and then closed it behind herself. Manning tried to stand up, but was unsuccessful at first. At length he managed to stand, and his head swelled. I need a drink, he said quietly to himself, as he held both sides of his head in his hands. With great effort he snapped his metal shorts on, which he suddenly realized that Clara had so kindly removed and washed for him. Then he slid into his trench coat that had also been cleaned and meandered down out of his room and down the stairs. The crowded bar all stared at him as he entered. He half walked and half stumbled over to the bar, and Terry immediately poured his friend a drink. He gulped it down quickly, and then turned to the crowd solemnly. I owe you folks an explanation, he began, as he scratched his shaggy beard, which did not match his elongated sideburns at all. His brown hair was dirty, but uncombed, he realized, as everyone was staring at him. His cheeks suddenly swelled, and he felt them burning, as if he were still standing in the desert sun. Out with it, Ida Pritchard demanded angrily. Gray looked at her sadly, and with a heavy heart he began. We were ambushed on our way to Sacramento. Somehow they got word of our approach. We were supposed to be in friendly territory. I ordered the unit to drive to our campsite, which was over an hour away, so I decided to get some sleep. I woke up when the Jeep exploded. I barely managed to get out of there. So you left my chance to die, Pierre cried sadly. No, sir, Gray told him solemnly. After we were ambushed, it was just down to Jagger, Chance, and myself. Jagger was hit, and we returned fire and made our way for the tree line. There was nothing I could have done for him. Chance. At this point he nearly choked at the memory of his friend and stumbled forward. Pierre jumped forward and steadied him as he put one arm around Gray. Chance was a soldier and would have had no other life. Telling me how he died. Gray looked at the strong build of the lumberjack who had been his friend and neighbor sadly. Sniper round through the throat, he informed the man slowly. No better soldier I've ever served with. Tears began to well in Pierre's eyes. Yeah, I can see in your eyes you speak true. That's good enough for me. A bottle suddenly broke over Pierre's head as one of the strangers Clara had mentioned struck him. The big man fell over instantly as Gray turned and looked into the eyes of a strong-looking youth with red hair. Well, it ain't good enough for me, he shouted. Jagger was my cousin, and you led him to his death, you son of a bitch. Terry suddenly found a pistol pointed at his face as he reached for his shotgun, and he quickly raised his hands into the air. Easy there, barkeep. Another red-haired young man said to him harshly. Rusty's got a point there. Jagger was my cousin, too. Phil, who had always been Gray's most stout defender, jumped up, but found Ida Pritchard shoving a knife in his way and stopped him cold. He got my boy killed, she shouted at him. Her face was grief-stricken. It was clear to the man before her that she meant business, so he stepped back. An older, larger man stepped towards Gray as he revealed the bullwhip that was under his jacket. Some savior, he said to Banning coldly. My sister is right, and you got my nephew killed. Same as you did it yourself. The crowd at the bar were all frozen in bewilderment, and just stared at the proceedings in abject terror. You tell him, Pa, the youth holding Terry at bay shouted. Let's string him up. Patience, Jim, his father commanded. All in good time. First I'm going to teach this boy a lesson. At this point, Gray lost all patience. Look, sir, I am truly sorry about what happened, but there's nothing I can do to change it. Jagger was my friend, and if I could have given my life for him, I would have. The larger man lunged forward and raised his fist. Ordinarily, the Grey Fury would have easily blocked such an attack, but in his weakened state, he was too slow. The fist struck him across the jaw, and then the older man punched Gray in the stomach, ignoring the pain from striking metal, and then grabbed him by the throat and looked him directly in the eyes as they were now face to face. Rest assured, he began slowly, you will give your life for Jagger. The outer doors of the bar slammed open abruptly, and a man quickly stepped into the doorway. He was dressed in army camouflage from head to foot. A bandolier of knives was stretched from his shoulder to his hip, upon which a pistol rested in its holster at the ready, and it was clear that he carried far more in his own personal arsenal. The newcomer looked at the ruffians and quickly discovered that there were 3 more men waiting on the sidelines to aid those that had already set the bar in a sudden state of terror. Everyone froze as all eyes were on the soldier standing in the doorway. The man calmly stepped into the bar and closed the door behind himself. His gaze circled the room, and at length his eyes rested upon the man that held the obviously weakened Grey Fury aloft so savagely. "I suggest you cease your hostile actions," he said to them calmly. "And if we don't?" the older man demanded in an equally cool manner. The soldier cocked his head slightly and sucked his teeth for only an instant. "Then I'll be forced to intervene." His voice was even and confident, and betrayed nothing. "I got him, Pa!" Rusty shouted as he started to point his gun at the newcomer. In one swift motion, the camouflaged soldier freed a dagger from his bandolier, and it flew into Rusty's hand. "Arr!" he cried in pain as a bullwhip cracked and struck the newcomer in the face. "Intervene? Ha! You'll die for that!" the older man shouted, and he swung his whip again. The soldier snatched the whip out of the air easily as it hurtled towards him again. With a smooth gesture, he calmly wiped the blood from the fresh and open wound on his cheek. "If that's how you want it, I shall simply have to teach you ruffians some manners." He pulled the whip taut, and the older man lunged forward helplessly. The camouflaged stranger, with striking brilliant blue eyes, swiftly put his knee sharply into the older man's groin, and then brought his hand down sharply on the back of his neck. From there, everything happened at once. The stranger swiftly cracked the whip and struck Jim's hand, and the gun, which he had pointed at Terry, fell to the ground. The other 3 men that were standing at the ready rushed him, but he turned the aggression against them, and soon another was sprawled out on the floor next to the other man. The other 2 practically fell into each other, so that by the time Rusty and Jim joined in the fray, the 2 others were lying on the ground next to their father. The soldier eyed them coldly for a moment, which caused them to stop short and stare at him. "I can hurt you both very badly," the man informed them sincerely. "So let's see how smart you both are. Pick up your friends and move on." Suddenly, Ida turned and pointed the gun that Jim had dropped at the soldier and moved towards him, but the stranger paid her no mind, as old Thomas Miller hit her square in the face with his cane, forcing her to drop the weapon. Phil grabbed her quickly and sat her down roughly in a nearby chair. The 2 brothers suddenly glared at the soldier angrily and charged forward. He took Jim out first with a swift kick to the stomach, and the poor youth lunged over and gasped for breath. Rusty swung at the stranger fiercely, but the man quickly blocked his attack and grabbed his still wounded hand. Then he swiftly pulled the knife from it. "I believe this is mine," he said calmly. Suddenly a shotgun blast demanded everyone's attention as they all looked at Terry. He still held the smoking gun aloft and had a fiery look in his eyes. "Jim," he shouted at the youth, "you and Rusty had better get your dad and cousins up and get them out of here." The young man nodded compliantly, and even though his brother complained, he quickly compelled him to comply. In only a few seconds they were moving towards the door, but Terry had wasted no time, as his gaze fell on Ida Pritchard, and she looked up at him furiously. "Woman, you'd best go with your kinfolk. You're not welcome back here till you calm down and apologize." She glared at him harshly, so he quickly added, "I know you're grieving, Ida, but it ain't no cause for murder. Gray didn't kill your boy. He chose the life he led, and nothing on God's green earth would have stopped him. Believe me when I say that I won't hold a grudge against you for this fiasco, but that don't mean I ain't offended and angry now." At this she nodded, as she graciously got up and left the bar with her kid. At length the bartender pointed the gun at the camouflaged stranger. "Mister, I don't know who you are, and you have my thanks, but I can't let you stay here with all those weapons on you." The soldier stared at the bartender stoically, and then frowned. "This affair has been a question of intelligence," he began, "or in the case of those rednecks, the lack thereof. I never give up my weapons. So shall we put ourselves to the test, or shall you point that in another direction?" Their eyes locked sternly. Both men were dead serious, and one of them would die if the bartender wouldn't back off. Neither man was giving, as Terry's finger tightened on the trigger of his shotgun, and the soldier lightly held the hilt of one of his knives that rested in his bandolier. Somewhere deep inside the bartender, he slowly realized that being macho wasn't worth his life, so he slowly lowered the gun. "Wise," the stranger informed him coolly. "Very wise." "Wise man, you mean?" The soldier and the bartender both turned to look at the Grey Fury. He had gotten up and managed to sit up upon a bar stool as Clara was pouring him another drink. "Wise man McFab," he said to them with a smile, and then looked at the stranger. "How you doing, Sergeant?" he asked the soldier as he gestured for him to take a seat. Terry threw up his hands and muttered, "I should have known." Then he walked casually back behind the bar. "Alert as always," the soldier replied in answer to the Grey Fury's question. "And you, Captain?" "Pissed, as always," Grey informed him with a laugh, and then admitted, "But I can say I have been better." He grimaced in pain as he took a drink. "I can see that," McFab said as he retorted with a short snicker. "So what brings you to my neck of the woods?" Banning asked him point blank. "I mean, the last time I saw you, you said you were going to grow a garden and meditate." "Man's got to have a hobby," the soldier replied sarcastically, as Gray muttered, "Right." And then the sergeant looked at Gray seriously and said, "I need your help." "Figures," his former captain stated bluntly, "but I've got a lot going on right now." "I'm serious," McFab exclaimed desperately. "You know that I wouldn't have come to you if I were not." "Huh," Gray muttered, and then looked at his old friend sternly. "There'll be a price." "There always is," the sergeant nodded knowingly. "Perhaps we can help each other." "Oh," was Gray's only response. "I know who ambushed you and your men." Suddenly Fury looked at McFab grimly. "It was not so much a statement of a probability as it was a fact." "After this is done," Gray began quietly as he returned his attention to his drink, "I get 2 years out of you minimum." "So be it," McFab said to him with a smile, and then added, "I was getting bored anyway." They stared at each other for a moment, and then nodded solemnly. Terry asked McFab if he wanted a drink, and the sergeant asked for milk, at which the bartender laughed heartily. He quickly sent Clara to get some. The crowded bar was still tense, but slowly eased off as it became clear that there would be nothing else to see here today. It was clear to everyone that their friend and longtime protector needed to drink his sorrows away, so they left him be for the remainder of the day. End of chapter. Now, I might read more of this another time. Depends on how well it's received and if you guys like it. So that's Grey Fury, the Grey Truth. I hope you enjoyed it. As I said, the first part of that chapter only I had written for a school project, and I had gotten an A in it. So I liked it a lot, and that's what inspired me to write the rest of the book and move on into chapter 2. But once I got into chapter 2 and the hunt is on, it just flowed from there. All right, that was the Great Truth. And with that all being said, Logan out.